Hello, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and welcome to episode 42 of my Logic Pro 10 video tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the Randomizer plugin, which is one of the many new MIDI effects plugins included with Logic 10. What the Randomizer does is it allows us to randomize different types of MIDI events. So this includes things like velocity, it includes things like aftertouch and polyphonic aftertouch, pitch bend, as well as our 128 different MIDI continuous controllers. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to randomize velocity with the synthesizer, as well as how to randomize the modulation wheel. So before I turn this plugin on, as you can see here, it's disabled. I just want to give you an idea of what I'm working with and also the synth that I'm using, because I realize not everyone is at the same level as far as your abilities to program and understand synthesizers. So I'll play you what I have here, and then I'll also explain what synth patch I'm using for this. So this is just what this musical example sounds like. And this synth also has a kind of like a filter sweep effect on it that's controlled by the modulation wheel. So if I move the modulation wheel up and down while this is playing, I'll get something like this. So as I move the modulation wheel up, I'm getting more of sort of the bright tones. As I move it down, I'm getting more of the darker tones. So just so you know, I'm using the ES2 instrument for this. I actually just used a preset. It's a preset called Hammer Lead. And just to show you what I did, I'll recall the default setting here. Basically what I did is I just chose the Hammer Lead preset, which is under Synth Leads and then Hammer Lead. And what I did was I basically turned off all of these modulation routers that have effects on them, and you can do that just by holding Option and clicking on the target parameter. Basically turns all those off. And I wanted sort of a filter sweep sort of effect with the modulation wheel. So what I did was I went to my first router here and I changed the target to cutoff 1, which is the cutoff frequency of filter 1, which is right here. And then I also, on the via parameter, I changed that to modulation wheel because I want the modulation wheel to control that motion. And for the source, because I want the modulation wheel to directly control the cutoff, rather than using something like an LFO or an envelope, I changed the source to max. This kind of orange and green slider here controls the depth of the modulation. So what I do is click on this little 0 here to set it to the center, and then create sort of like a bit of a range for it. It's basically just a high and low range for it. And then what I'm going to do is go up to the cutoff knob here, and I'm just going to pull it up to just under halfway. This particular synth patch uses not one but both filters. There's 2 filters in the ES2. The last thing I want to do for my Hammer Lead preset here is I want to make the velocity sensitivity be all the way up. And that basically means that volume is going to be fully controlled by velocity, since the 2 examples I want to give you for this video are randomizing modulation wheel and then also randomizing velocity. So that's how I came up came up with this, this particular setting. So now if I press play, I should be able to move my modulation wheel up and down, and it should create that filter swept sound that we heard before. There you go. Okay, so first let's look at let's turn on the Randomizer plugin and open it up. Let's take a look at randomizing velocity. When you randomize velocity, pretty much any MIDI data byte value, you're working with a range from 0 to 127, the minimum and maximum value. So there's multiple sliders here that all can kind of constrict or expand the range of the randomization. that you have an input range, two input range sliders, which basically control the minimum and maximum value of values that will be randomized. For velocity, I want the entire 0 to 127 range to be randomized. I want every note to be random, to be capable of being randomized. So I'm going to keep this at 0 to 127. What you can set down here is the actual randomization range. So if you pull this all the way up, it means that the notes that are actually going to play can be anywhere between 0 and 127, regardless of what the original velocities were. So if I pull this down, I can narrow that range, and I can say, well, I want all of the notes to be, between about 40 and 80, and you can set that range here. The other thing you can do is you can set the weight. The weight is basically how often are higher or lower values going to be triggered. So if I want to hear more higher values, I can pull this up. And if I want to hear more lower values, I can pull this down. For velocity, I'm going to keep that at center. And I'm also going to pull the randomization all the way up. Now, the output offset is how much is added to the output value. So if you randomize, let's say my input velocity was 60, the randomized value was 80. You can take that randomized value of 80, you can add up to 127 to it, or subtract up to 127 to it. So you can, again, kind of boost the high or low range of your randomized notes. Or if you just completely pull it all the way up or all the way down, then you can just fix those values to one value. So just keeping this basically on the stock setting, let's see what this sounds like. Most of the velocities in my original recording are about the same. It looks like they're mostly... I'm going to say probably about the 80-90 range. So let's take a listen to what these sound like. Let me just pull the modulation wheel up a bit so we can get a little more open filter in there. So you can hear that some of the notes are very loud, some are very quiet. They're kind of jumping around anywhere between 0 and 127. If I want to kind of constrict that range, well, I can pull down the random amount like I talked about earlier, and I can get a more constricted range, within 55 values, again, between 0 and 127. And another thing you can do with this plugin is not really even a randomizer at all. You can kind of fix all of your velocities to the same value. So if I just say output offset 127, it basically means every single note is going to be maximum velocity. So you can kind of fix all of your notes to the same velocity with this plugin as well. So let's move on to something maybe a little more interesting. For this next example, let's choose, instead of velocity, let's choose the modulation wheel. The modulation wheel, as I said before, is controlling this sort of kind of filter sweep effect. And actually, let me turn off the randomizer because it's already affecting it. So the modulation wheel is kind of a cool, a cool thing here to kind of create a little more dynamics and some tonal changes, in the middle of a lead or a bass line or something like that. But what if I wanted to randomize the value of that modulation wheel? Well, that's where the randomizer plugin comes into play. So let me just go back to the default setting just for a moment. Turn this on. Again, I'll change this to modulation wheel. And you would think that at this point, all of the notes would have a random modulation wheel value between 0 and 127. Let's see if that's true. It's not true. And this actually goes for pretty much everything other than velocity and note number on here. Everything on here. There's something tricky you have to do to make this work correctly for all of the MIDI CCs, pitch bend, tuning, aftertouch, and other than velocity, and as well as note number, that you have to do to kind of make this work properly. Because my MIDI region doesn't actually contain any modulation wheel messages, there's nothing to randomize. So what we have to do is either play in modulation wheel just haphazardly and just play in some values while this is playing, or what we have to do, the second thing we can do, is we need to actually create some modulation wheel messages within our MIDI region. So that's actually what I'm going to do. And actually, just so you can see it the other way, if I just press play and then just kind of haphazardly move the modulation wheel, and I'm going to move it slowly, what you'll hear is that the values are completely random and just going all over the place. So the modulation wheel, that filter sweep that's tied to the modulation wheel, is kind of just jumping all over the place. And I was actually barely moving the modulation wheel. I was just barely moving it up and down around the center position. So what we can do instead to kind of randomize the modulation wheel is we can add a consistent basically modulation wheel value across this region. And I actually didn't think I'd ever show this editor in the main series of this tutorial series, but there is a use for it here. The editor that we can use to add just a consistent modulation wheel value across this entire MIDI region is the step editor. Now, the step editor can be found under Window, Step Editor. It used to be called the Hyper Editor in Logic 9, and it's basically a way to edit MIDI continuous controllers and other MIDI events like pan and volume. It's kind of like the old school way of writing MIDI automation, like I showed you in the when we talked about the MIDI draw function in the piano roll editor. It's kind of like the old school way of writing MIDI automation, but there is a use for it here. Basically, what I'm going to do is on the modulation wheel lane here, I'm going to make sure that the grid value is set to an 8th note. I think by default it's set to a 16th note. The only reason I'm using an 8th note is I want one modulation wheel message per 8th note, because in the example, the musical example, it's an 8th note pattern. So I want every note to kind of have a different randomized modulation wheel value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the pencil tool to kind of draw in just just a straight line across the modulation wheel lane here. And I'll just make sure that's completely filled in. Now, all the values aren't the same. Well, this is where the line tool comes into play. What we can do is we can use the line tool to set all of these values to the same value. Now, I'm basically just eyeing it here, but they're about the same value. So when I go back out to the arrange window here, you'll see that there's a new MIDI modulation wheel message for every 8th note in the region. And again, I didn't get it perfect. You can see there that it goes up a bit, but for the most part, looks about 70, between 0 and 127. It looks like our modulation wheel is set to about 70. So if I turn off the randomizer and press play, it's not going to matter whether I move my modulation wheel up or down now, because there's a written modulation wheel message in the actual MIDI region. And so it'll always stay at that position as long as the randomizer plugin isn't on. Now that we've actually written a modulation wheel message into the MIDI region, we can turn the randomizer on, and we can choose the modulation wheel as our event, set an input range, set the randomization range. I'll just lower it a bit. Set the low versus high weight. I'm going to pull this down a bit when I hear a bit more lows than highs. And then hit play. And we'll hear that every single note's actually going to have a random value now. And there you go. So I realize this is just scratching the surface as far as the step editor and the randomizer is concerned, but that's basically all I could fit in one 15-minute long video. So hopefully this has been helpful for you, and I hope you enjoyed the video. And again, thanks for watching.